Can I play it for my mom?" They laughed at the maid's daughter, unaware she's a piano virtuoso. The golden chandelier above the St. James Hall glittered like a constellation frozen in arrogance. Laughter floated among the tuxedos and pearls, the kind of laughter that fed on other people's discomfort. Near the center, a polished grand piano gleamed under the lights, awaiting its next performer. At the edge of the hall, Susan Peterson, the maid who had spent a decade polishing these very marble floors, stood silently in her black uniform, holding a tray of empty glasses. Beside her, her daughter Clara waited, small hands folded, her eyes wide with curiosity and a soft kind of hope. She was only 10, with tangled chestnut hair and a shy smile that never quite stayed long enough. Julian Croft, the evening's host and self-proclaimed virtuoso, noticed them. His smirk appeared the way storm clouds do, slow and heavy. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice smooth as silk and sharp as glass, "it seems our little helper brought company. How charming! Tell me, young lady, have you ever played the piano?" The laughter came instantly, rippling through the audience like a cruel wind. Susan froze. Her fingers tightened around the tray until her knuckles turned white. "Mr. Croft, please, she's just a child." But Clara spoke before her mother could finish. Her voice was calm, almost too calm. "I can play," she said quietly. Croft leaned forward, clearly amused. "Oh, really? And what masterpiece shall we expect, miss?" "Clara," she replied, "I just want to play something for my mom." The room chuckled again, indulgent and dismissive. Croft gestured toward the piano with mock courtesy. "By all means, Miss Clara, the stage is yours." Susan whispered, "Sweetheart, you don't have to." But Clara was already walking forward, her small shoes clicking softly against the marble. She climbed onto the piano bench, legs barely reaching the pedals, and let her fingers hover above the keys. The room held its breath, half in mockery, half in curiosity. Then came the first note. It was tender, fragile, but it carried weight. One note became a phrase, one phrase became a storm. The melody unfolded with a clarity no one expected, a haunting, impossible beauty that silenced the hall. The notes rose, fell, twisted, and burned with emotion deeper than words. Susan's eyes filled with tears. The chandelier light shimmered through them like liquid gold. When the final chord faded, the silence was absolute. Croft's face had gone pale. Someone in the back whispered, "My God!" And in that stillness, Clara looked up and asked softly, "May I play another?" It's her favorite. After the applause finally came, hesitant at first, then honest, it washed over the marble like rain over dry ground. Croft recovered his smile and announced a brief intermission, the way a magician does when his trick fails and he needs new cards. People spilled toward the bar, speaking in low, excited voices, already mythologizing what they'd just heard. Clara slipped off the bench and hurried back to her mother, who cupped her face with trembling hands. "You didn't have to be brave for me," Susan whispered. "I wasn't," Clara said, eyes shining. "I was home." The St. James wasn't made for people like them. By day, Susan polished the very banisters the members slid their hands across without seeing. By night, she took extra shifts in the service corridor where the light hummed and the air tasted like old metal. She wore the same plain shoes, winter and summer, marked by a permanent crescent where the leather had split and been glued back. If the club had a soul, Susan knew where it hid: the broom closets, the maintenance tunnels, the boiler room. Clara knew it too. She knew the secret door behind the kitchen that opened onto a narrow stair. She knew which hallway squeaked when the elevator cables sighed. And deepest of all, she knew the basement, where the first grand piano of the St. James slept beneath a moth-eaten tarp, a century-old Steinway quietly gathering dust, while its newer, brighter sibling basked upstairs. That basement was where Clara learned the language of the instrument, not from a teacher with a metronome, but from her great-grandfather Marcus Peterson, who sat with her most Sundays after church and taught her the shape of sound the way he'd once taught soldiers the shape of a battlefield. Marcus had been a strategist, a general whose name lived in history books, and everything he knew about flanks and supply lines he mapped onto the keyboard. "Don't chase," he would murmur, tapping middle C with a gnarled finger. "Occupy. Hold the center. Make the other side spend more energy than you do. A loud attack fades. A quiet plan survives." He did not teach her pieces first. He taught her principles, how a melody draws power from a stable left hand, the way an army draws power from a secure line, how dynamics are not volume for its own sake, but pressure. Pressure you apply and relieve the way you would on a hinge to make a door sing rather than scream. He showed her how silence is not absence, but position. "Rest," he'd say, eyes alight. "Rest is the pause where a listener leans in." Clara learned fast. She didn't read measures so much as landscapes. A motif wasn't notes, it was terrain. A modulation wasn't a trick, it was a river crossing. When she practiced, she saw color. Summer blues for major keys, winter greens for minor, and a red gold that lived only in E-flat whenever she played for her mother after long days when the world had scraped Susan too thin. They owned no piano at home. Practice happened in minutes stolen. She would wait until the kitchen closed and the last tray clattered, then slip down to the basement and lift the tarp. The old Steinway woke like an animal remembering its own name. Some nights, the night watchman, Mr. Halverson, whose back had bent into a question mark after 50 years of moving furniture that wasn't his, would sit in a folding chair with a thermos. He never spoke while she played. Afterward he'd say, "You have a left hand like a promise, kid. Don't let anyone pick your pockets while you listen to applause." Upstairs, the club glittered with a different philosophy. Buy brilliance, display it, drink to it. Tonight's charity exhibition was supposed to feed that appetite. Julian Croft, the golden boy, was a virtuoso of a different kind, the kind who could execute with speed and precision and look good doing it. He loved Chopin the way a peacock loves a mirror. He loved Scarlatti as long as the light hit him just right. He also loved control. He chose repertoire that put his strengths under a spotlight and his weaknesses behind velvet rope. He never played Ravel in public. He was too liquid, too hard to dominate. He rarely played Bach. The counterpoint demanded humility. Instead, he told polished stories about his conservatory days, about prodigy and destiny, about the poor being uplifted by exposure to excellence as if excellence were a vitamin. The St. James Board adored him. He opened their galas and christened their seasons. He teased them from the stage, and they laughed, glad to be close to genius. That was what made his cruelty tonight feel like entertainment, a harmless little jab at the help. Except the help had answered in the only language that mattered, beauty that did not beg permission. While guests milled, Croft retreated to the green room with a drink he didn't touch. He replayed the child's phrasing in his head and couldn't find the seam where imitation had been stitched into it. He recognized echoes, Debussy's water, a hint of Chopin's rain, but the architecture wasn't borrowed. It was inevitable. A theme introduced with restraint, developed without waste, returned with courage. It was the kind of inevitability you don't fake at 10. He stared at his own hands, expensive hands, trained hands, and felt, for the first time in years, the creeping recognition that technique without truth is just noise in a tuxedo. Back in the hall, Susan stood with the tray hugged to her chest. A few members offered brittle compliments, the kind people give when they are unsure if they were wrong 5 minutes ago. "Quite a memory she has," one said. "Children are such parrots." Susan nodded politely and stored the words with all the other things she had learned to forgive without forgetting. At the edge of the room stood a man with silver hair and the kind of tailored silence that suggests either wealth or wisdom. Sometimes they come together, sometimes not. He watched Clara with a soft intensity, as if measuring the distance between what she'd just done and what she could yet do. He did not applaud the way others had, loud to cover their surprise. He held his hand still. When Clara caught him looking, she offered a small, awkward wave. He returned it with a smile that touched his eyes. No one introduced him. No one needed to. He was the club's quiet benefactor, the one whose name lived on brass plaques but whose voice rarely lived in the room. On the ledger, he was James Avery. In private, he had once played a little, long ago, in a practice room that smelled like cheap varnish and hope. When his father fell ill, he left the conservatory for commerce. He built a fortune and buried the piano. Hearing Clara felt like finding a photograph in a coat he thought he'd thrown away. When the intermission ended, Croft returned to the stage with new care in his posture. He adjusted the bench, glanced at Clara, and chose, without quite knowing why, a Bach prelude he hadn't performed in years. The room was not kind to clarity. It preferred shimmer over structure, but something in him wanted a reckoning with honesty. He began. The first measures came clean, then a hitch, where the left-hand pattern should have breathed without asking. He recovered, but the flaw was there, a tiny misalignment the human ear registers as insincerity. He played on, beautiful as ever, and felt for the first time that he wasn't alone on the stage. The child's quiet plan sat beside him, unblinking. When he finished, the applause was warm, warmer than he deserved, perhaps. He stood, inclined his head, and made his choice. "Miss Clara," he said into the microphone, voice gentler now, "would you honor us with another?" Gasps. A few clucked tongues. This wasn't in the program. But the room was already leaning toward the small figure in the wings. Susan touched her daughter's shoulder. "Only if you want." Clara looked up at the chandelier as if it were a page of music. "I'd like to play something my great-grandfather loved," she said. "He told me it was about holding the center when you're outnumbered." She walked to the bench. She did not look small anymore. She looked accurate. She placed her fingers on the keys and, without flourish, called the room to order, with the simplest of openings, the way her great-grandfather had taught her, not with thunder, but with a line so true that everything else had to fall in around it. Up in the balcony, James Avery folded his arms against the rail and felt a door inside him swing on a hinge he hadn't oiled in years. Down on the floor, Susan exhaled for the first time all night. In the wings, Croft closed his eyes and listened, understanding, dimly, fearfully, gratefully, that he was being offered a chance to become better than the version of himself the club purchased. The room, which had always chosen spectacle over substance, began, one note at a time, to remember the difference. The next afternoon, the headlines in the St. James Gazette read, "The Prodigy Maid's Daughter, a night the club will never forget." The article was short, almost clinical, but the title alone was enough to ignite gossip. For the members, it was entertainment. For the staff, it was a quiet revolution. Clara's name, whispered between dishes and dusters, became a kind of password, a story people told themselves to remember that maybe the walls weren't as thick as they looked. But not everyone was pleased. Julian Croft's humiliation had gone viral in ways he hadn't expected. Someone had filmed the moment he froze mid-performance, jaw tight as the child played. The clip had been uploaded to social media with the caption, "When talent meets truth." The comments were merciless. Sponsors called to reconsider his image alignment. Even the chairman of the club suggested that a few months of low-profile reflection might help. Behind his polite smile, Croft's pride howled. The applause for Clara had not merely embarrassed him, it had displaced him. And worse, the benefactor, James Avery, had taken a quiet interest in the girl. 2 weeks later, the St. James Club announced a charity concert titled Music Without Borders. Clara was invited to open the event as a gesture of inclusivity. It was framed as kindness. But the truth was sharper. Croft had arranged the entire evening. Susan knew something was wrong the moment she saw the program. Clara was placed immediately before Croft's headlining concerto, a perfect setup for comparison. The schedule read like a duel disguised as generosity. That evening, the hall was packed again. Chandeliers blazed, cameras flashed, and Clara, dressed in a borrowed white dress that was slightly too big, sat alone behind the curtain, her legs swinging nervously. Her mother knelt beside her, adjusting the ribbon on her wrist. "You don't have to prove anything," Susan said. Clara nodded, but she remembered something her great-grandfather had told her long ago. "When people laugh at you, they've already given you space on the battlefield. Use it." Croft appeared in the doorway, smiling with all his teeth. "Ready, little star?" he asked, his tone drenched in charm. "You remember, yes? Just enjoy yourself. The audience can be difficult." "I'll try," she said softly. When she stepped on stage, the applause was polite but tepid. The novelty had faded. Some came to see a miracle, others to witness a fall. She sat, took a breath, and placed her hands on the keys. The first chord rang out, not gentle this time, but deliberate, powerful, defiant. It was Beethoven's Sonata Pathétique, a piece her great-grandfather had once played to remind soldiers that grief could march beside courage. Every note was clean, each crescendo blooming like a sunrise after artillery fire. The audience leaned forward. Croft, standing just off stage, felt the same crawling sensation as before, a blend of admiration and panic. She wasn't performing anymore, she was commanding. Halfway through the adagio, something miraculous happened. The chandeliers seemed to dim as if the hall itself were listening. Clara's left hand, steady and strong, carried the melody's weight, while her right whispered the promise of survival. When the final chord lingered and dissolved into silence, the audience did not move. Then came the sound of someone standing, James Avery. He didn't clap first, he simply stood tall and still, and the rest of the hall followed like a tide breaking loose. Croft walked onto the stage, applauding slowly. "Marvelous," he said into the microphone. "Truly marvelous. And now, ladies and gentlemen, if you'll allow me, I'll show you what years of mastery sound like." His words cut through the applause like a blade through silk. Susan flinched. Clara rose from the bench and stepped aside. "Yes, Mr. Croft," she said gently. "Please do." Croft sat down, his face serene, but his heart pounding with the desperate rhythm of a man about to reclaim his throne. He began Liszt's Hungarian Rhapsody No. 2, thunderous, showy, designed to dominate. The hall vibrated with fury and fireworks. For 5 minutes he dazzled them, his hands blurred, his expression raptured. But as the piece reached its climax, something went wrong. One note slipped, then another. A bead of sweat fell. His right hand hesitated, half a heartbeat too long. From the corner of his eye he saw Clara watching him, not with pride, not with pity, but with the same stillness she'd shown when she played. It broke him. The crowd heard it too. His timing faltered, the melody cracked. He finished with a furious flourish, forcing the audience to clap. It was applause born of obligation, not awe. James Avery rose again, but this time he didn't look at Croft. He looked at Clara. "Miss Peterson," he said, his deep voice carrying across the hall, "would you do me a favor?" "Yes, sir." "Would you play something together? You and I?" A murmur rippled through the room. Croft froze. Avery stepped onto the stage and sat beside the girl, his movements confident but unpretentious. He whispered something only she could hear. "When I was your age, I wanted to play for my mother, too." They began a duet, Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. Avery took the bass, Clara the melody. Their harmony filled the room like light breaking through stained glass. Croft stepped back, the spotlight leaving him for good. When the final notes faded, Avery looked at Clara and said softly, "You remind me what art is for." On Sundays, when the city's bells drifted like driftwood over the rooftops, Clara and her mother would take the bus to a brick townhouse that remembered sunlight. The door stuck in winter, the stairs sighed in summer, and on the second floor lived a man whose bones had learned the weather. Marcus Peterson, great-grandfather, soldier, strategist, the quiet drum at the center of their small family parade. His medals hung in a shadow box above a walnut bureau. He pretended not to notice them. "Shiny memories make bad advisers," he'd say, tapping the glass once and turning away. What he kept within reach were other tools, a chipped metronome that rarely worked, a pencil sharpened to a dangerous point, and a battered copy of Bach that smelled faintly of tobacco and rain. "Soldiers need maps," he told Clara the first day he sat her at the old upright in his front room. "Musicians need them too. The map is not the notes. It's the way the air will feel if you get it right." He drew lines on blank paper, a square for middle C, home base, arrows for motion, supply lines, circles for tension, pressure points. "When you panic," he said, "you run to the center you've secured. When you don't know what to say, you return to the truth you've built." He pressed her left hand into a simple pattern. Tonic, dominant, subdominant, back, the musical equivalent of digging in and holding ground. "This," he murmured, "is why your right hand can be brave." Sometimes he taught through stories, his voice lowering as if the past could eavesdrop. He described a night in a foreign desert when radios failed and maps lied. "We'd have died," he said softly, "if we hadn't remembered how to listen." He tapped the score. Counterpoint is like that. Two truths at once. You hold them both without letting either one get drowned. Clara learned to breathe in measures. She learned that rubato was not stealing time, but borrowing it with interest. She learned to fear the pedal less and silence more. Rest, Marcus would say, hitting the metronome to life so it ticked for 6 glorious seconds before quitting again. Rest is where you show mercy to a phrase. On the worst days, when Susan came in from the rain with hands raw from bleach and the club's laughter still stuck to her clothes, Marcus would send Clara to the basement of the St. James with a key he had kept from the days when he'd consulted on the building's security. "Take the tarp off slowly," he instructed. "Let the dust remember it was wood once." Clara would lift the moth-eaten cover, and the old Steinway would blink awake like a creature coaxed from hibernation. She would play something red gold, something in E-flat, and watch her mother's shoulders lower as if 100 tiny soldiers had set down their packs. Music wasn't an escape. It was a fort raised quickly in dangerous territory. It was soup on bad nights and light on worse mornings. It was, above all, permission to feel large in a world that called them small. Marcus never said he had nightmares, but sometimes, when Clara fumbled a passage, his hand shook on the edge of the music stand, and his gaze fell not on her, but through her, beyond the wall. After a few breaths, he would return and ask her to play the left hand alone. "Secure the ground," he'd whisper, "then we'll cross the river." When he died, he did it the way he had lived, without ceremony, with clear orders. He left a note for Susan in a coffee can in the pantry. "All my noise is yours now. Teach her not to be afraid of it." He left for Clara a coin from a long-ago unit and the metronome that barely ticked. On the bottom, he had scratched a single word with a pocket-knife: "Hold." After the funeral, Susan packed away grief the way she packed linens, carefully, respectfully, in a place that could be reopened when needed. Work did not stop simply because a heart had. Rent remained punctual and unromantic. The club remained itself. She moved through it like a shadow with a spine. Clara grew taller. Her shoes still squeaked in the service hallway, but her shoulders squared. She played in stolen hours and at borrowed instruments, learning to listen to rooms as much as scores. In the basement, her fingers discovered the difference between volume and force. At home, she learned that kindness given when no one is watching becomes a kind of weather. In another part of the city, years earlier, James Avery had learned an inverse lesson. He had been the son of a machinist who loved opera and a teacher who baked waltzes into Saturday mornings. In a single semester at the conservatory, he fell in love with harmony like a person, uncertain, overwhelming, unreasonable. He practiced until the custodian flicked the lights. He played restaurant gigs for tips in a jar that smelled like lemons and copper. Then his father's first stroke arrived like a door kicked in. James left the practice room and took a job that had no pedals. His days filled with ledgers, his nights filled with numbers. He promised he would go back when things stabilized, when the world stopped asking him to be useful at every hour. Stability arrived. Then it made rent for a larger life. Then it purchased buildings and influence and silence. The piano, patient as a saint, began to seem ridiculous, a childish thing, a luxury, a door to a room he could no longer justify entering. He kept his mother's sheet music in a cedar box and told himself that not wanting was a form of maturity. The first time he heard Clara, the argument he had built against his own heart failed without drama. It didn't shatter, it opened. Her sound had no apology in it. Her left hand promised, her right hand hoped. He recognized the structure of resolve not from music, but from the men he had watched build factories with their backs. He recognized the rests Marcus had taught her, the mercy inside the measure, because he had forgotten to give any to himself. After the duet at Music Without Borders, he found them in the corridor, the maid, with a spine like a metronome at last keeping time, the child who played like a map-maker, and the old night watchman whose knees popped when he bowed as if courtesy itself were arthritic. "I knew your great-grandfather," Halverson said to James in a rusty baritone. "Back when this place was new, he used to test the alarm system with a broom handle and laugh like artillery when it worked." James smiled. "That sounds right." He turned to Susan. "May I help?" He didn't say sponsor or patron or talent pipeline. He said simply, help. "Help how?" Susan asked, wary but not hostile. "Time," he said. "Practice time when she wants it. A key that isn't a secret. A teacher who respects what she already knows." He hesitated, the past clearing its throat. "And when she's ready. A stage that doesn't expect her to apologize for being there. We don't take charity," Susan said automatically, the muscle memory of humiliation flexing. "Then don't," he answered. "Take partnership." Clara watched their faces the way she watched the keyboard before a difficult entrance, waiting for the breath that makes a phrase inevitable. She thought of Marcus's pencil pressing hold into the wood. She thought of the club's upstairs piano, brilliant and cold, and the basement Steinway, shy but faithful. She thought of Croft's showy thunder and Bach's clean sky. She thought most of all of her mother's hands, the red marks on them where bleach had turned skin into paper. "What if I play for everyone who can't be here?" she asked James, surprising them both. "Not just for the ones who pay?" His eyes lit. "Then we build rooms where the ticket is time." They did not shake hands. They nodded, three people agreeing to the shape of a new map. The weeks after were scaffolding. James arranged the practical mercies that turned talent into trajectory. An instrument installed in a community hall with good air and better hours. A teacher who began not with scales, but with listening. A schedule that bent around homework and sleep, not the other way around. He paid for nothing in front of a camera. He put his name on no door. If anyone asked, the piano had been there all along. Clara practiced with the coin from Marcus warmed in her palm. She learned difficult things gently and easy things honestly. She discovered that virtuosity is not speed. It is control offered without cruelty. She began to write small pieces, not grand, not clever, melodies that knew how to sit with people who had too much day left at night. She played them for the janitors on their breaks, for kids in the after-school program who drummed their pencils in 7/8, for a woman in a green coat who cried without hiding her face and said, "Thank you," like a vow. Croft watched from a distance at first, nursing his pride like a sprain. Then, on a quiet Tuesday, he came to the community hall and stood in the back while Clara practiced slowly, painfully, just the left hand of a Chopin nocturne for 20 minutes. He realized he had never done that, never honored the ground long enough to trust it. He sat down after she left and started at quarter speed. No cameras, no club, only the stubborn hope that he could still trade some of his polish for truth. The St. James changed by inches. A sign appeared at the basement door. Piano room. Open hours. The staff started lingering in the hall after closing, not because they had to, but because they were allowed to do something that wasn't labor. On Friday nights, the chandelier shimmered above a different kind of silence, the kind that leans in. In a drawer at home, Clara kept the metronome that barely ticked. She wound it before every performance, even though it would quit long before the second phrase. She did it for the same reason Marcus had scratched hold into its base, to remember what music is for when the room forgets, not to impress, but to steady. One evening before a small concert, James handed her a folded card. Inside was a single sentence in his mother's looping script, saved all these years. Play as if the person who needs it most is listening from the hallway. Clara smiled. She always is, she said, and glanced toward the door where Susan stood, half in the light, half in the work that never ends, her eyes bright, her shoulders unburdened for a blessed minute. Clara walked to the piano. She put the coin next to middle C and rested her left hand where the ground lives. Somewhere outside the hall, traffic sighed. Somewhere inside history, a soldier set down his pack and listened. When the first note came, it wasn't an announcement. It was a welcome. It happened on a cold Thursday in March, the kind of day when the city seemed to hum with waiting. The newspapers had begun whispering about the miracle child pianist. But it wasn't until the St. James Foundation announced its annual winter gala that the story reached its breaking point. For the first time in the club's 100-year history, the performance slot was to be decided by public vote. Julian Croft, reinstalled in the members' favor, announced his participation immediately. Sponsors cheered, donors smiled. A showman was reliable currency. But then the club's social media team, chasing engagement, included a surprise name in the poll, Clara Peterson. No one admitted who suggested it. Some said it was a PR stunt. The Maid's daughter was good for optics. Others whispered it was James Avery, quietly pulling threads. Either way, the vote went live Monday morning. By Tuesday, Clara was leading by thousands. By Wednesday, the servers crashed. The club tried to slow the momentum, citing technical discrepancies. The press smelled blood. By Thursday evening, the decision was irreversible. The people wanted her. The winter gala would open with a child whose mother still cleaned its marble halls. Susan took the news sitting down. "You don't owe them anything," she told her daughter. "I know," Clara said, "but maybe someone else needs to hear it." The night of the gala, the St. James transformed. Chandeliers glimmered, cameras multiplied, and guests arrived in suits so sharp they could cut regret. Croft was radiant in midnight velvet. Avery, uninvited but unbothered, took a seat near the back. Clara arrived with her mother, dressed simply in a navy dress that brushed her knees. The journalists swarmed. "How does it feel to be back where it all began? Are you nervous? Do you think it's fair to compete with professionals?" Susan tried to shield her, but Clara answered softly, "Music doesn't compete, it speaks." Backstage, Croft approached her with an almost tender smile. "You've had quite a run, haven't you? A story the papers love, but stories fade, Clara. Skills remain. Remember that." She met his eyes. "Then I'll play something you can't forget." The curtains parted. The applause was cautious, as if the crowd wasn't sure whether to cheer or brace for disappointment. Clara bowed once, adjusted the bench, and waited until the rustle of conversation quieted. Then, Without preamble, she began to play. It wasn't Beethoven or Chopin this time. It was hers. A piece she'd written herself in the small hours of the morning while her mother slept and the refrigerator clicked like a tired metronome. It began with a single note, middle C, repeated 3 times, each one softer, until it felt less like sound and more like breathing. Then, slowly, the melody unfolded, built from fragments of everything she had ever learned, the discipline of Bach, the sorrow of Beethoven, the mercy of Marcus, the honesty of silence. The music rose and fell like conversation, uncertain, intimate, human. There were moments that trembled on the edge of collapse and then, miraculously, resolved. It sounded like someone walking through memory with their hand on the wall, refusing to get lost. People leaned forward, forgetting to blink. A woman in the front row began to cry quietly. James Avery, sitting in the shadows, pressed his palm to his chest, where something old and tight began to loosen. When the final note came, it was not triumphant. It was patient. Clara lifted her hands from the keys and looked out at the audience. For a heartbeat, there was nothing. Then came the sound, one pair of hands, then another, until the applause grew into something living. Croft didn't move. He was staring at the stage, his face a war between pride and defeat. When the lights dimmed for intermission, he walked out through the side door and didn't return. Susan met her daughter backstage, eyes full. "What was that piece?" Clara smiled. "It's called Hold the Center." Afterward, journalists begged for interviews, sponsors offered scholarships, invitations flooded in from conservatories that had never opened their doors to people without lineage or legacy. Clara thanked them all and asked for time. She didn't want to chase what music was supposed to mean. She wanted to find what it actually did. 2 days later, an article appeared in the Tribune. A 10-year-old girl reminded a city that genius doesn't wear uniforms or titles. It listens, it remembers, and it forgives. The line was written by a man who hadn't signed his name, James Avery. The city moved differently after the gala. Buses felt warmer. Strangers held doors longer. In the mornings, delivery drivers rolled up the club's back alley and asked the line cooks if the Little Maestro would be playing again. The St. James was still the St. James, gold on the ceiling, rules in the carpet, but something inside it had tilted toward the open window. The board didn't know what to do with that breeze. They called an emergency session to discuss appropriate next steps. Croft was invited to frame the narrative. He arrived pressed and polite, shoulders squared the way a man's are when he's bargaining with his last good suit. "Emotions are high," he said smoothly. "We must preserve standards." James Avery sat at the end of the table, invited for once because everyone suspected the money might have an opinion. He looked at the agenda, then at the row of portraits lining the wall, men in oils staring into a future that had turned into a lobby. He said nothing at first. A junior board member cleared her throat. "There's been a groundswell. Families asking about lessons, staff requesting access to the basement piano after hours. The press wants a statement about our commitment to inclusive excellence." Croft steepled his fingers. "We can establish a scholarship, 1 student per year, a ceremony, a photo." James's voice was quiet, but carried. "Or we can build a school." Heads turned. He didn't raise his gaze. He simply laid a folio on the table, schematics, budgets, a list of names. "The practice rooms on the mezzanine haven't been used in a decade. We retrofit them. good ventilation, decent instruments, evening hours. We fund a program that belongs to the staff and their families. We open the basement piano to the public on Sundays with supervision. We don't brand it to death. We call it what it is, music available. A silence followed that sounded like fear recalculating its odds. Croft's smile thinned. With respect, Mr. Avery, the club is not a community center. We have a reputation to maintain. James finally met his eyes. Reputation is what people say about you when you're gone. Legacy is who gets to stay because of what you built. The vote took 30 minutes that felt like a century. In the end, money that had been meant for a third chandelier became wiring and soundproofing. The mezzanine exhaled. Hammers struck strings in dusty rooms where dust had been the only music for years. Word spread the way right things do, sideways, quietly, then all at once. On the first Sunday, a woman who did laundry for 2 floors of apartments sat at a practice upright and plunked out the lullaby her grandmother had taught her, wrong notes and all, crying and laughing. A busboy learned his first scale, then a second. Halverson brought a thermos and a stool and hurt in the good way from smiling. Susan stood in the doorway and felt the building become less of a job and more of a place. Clara didn't play much those Sundays. She walked, she listened, she tuned a note here and there with the visiting technician who taught her the holiness of a patient wrench. When a child froze at the keyboard, she didn't demonstrate. She placed the kid's left hand on the tonic and said, "This is your floor. Stand on it." Marcus's map, inked now in other palms. Croft came the second Sunday before opening, a concession he called inspection and meant confession. He asked for one room at the end of the hall, closed the door, and practiced scales at a tempo that respected his own humility. Twice he started to rush, and twice he stopped. On the third try, the evenness arrived, small and unremarkable and true. He found Clara in the corridor later, sitting on the floor with a notebook. "What are you writing?" he asked, and it wasn't condescension this time. It was the cautious voice of a man approaching a river. "Variations," she said, "on the song my mother hums when she irons." He crouched awkwardly. "I owe you an apology," he said, rehearsed words finally stripped of varnish. "You didn't take anything from me. You showed me what I'd put down." Clara nodded. "Do you want to play together?" she asked softly. "Just left hand, just for a while." He laughed once, hopeless and grateful. "Yes," he said, and for 10 minutes they did nothing fancy, nothing that would trend, just 2 people strengthening the ground. The pressure outside the club built into a wave the board hadn't planned for. A neighborhood school asked if the St. James would host a free concert. A hospital ward wrote a letter. Could someone come play on Thursdays for patients who were tired of machines that beeped in C major? A union local called to ask if evening lessons could be scheduled around shifts. "We're not a booking agency," a senior member muttered. "We are a room with doors," James said. "Let's try leaving one open." The concert that changed everything was not grand. No velvet ropes, no donor wall backdrop. The poster was printed at a corner copy shop, an evening for anyone who needs one. The ticket price was what people could spare. If that was nothing, the ushers had been instructed to smile and say welcome. Clara chose the program herself. No fireworks, no showpieces. Bach for honesty, Debussy for breath. One movement of Beethoven because courage needs a friend. In the middle, she placed Hold the Center, now slightly altered. one more measure of rest after a passage that had previously rushed, a nod to the lesson that cities and people both require patience to change. Before she began, she stood and spoke into the room, her voice steady. My great-grandfather told me that in battle, maps lie and compasses shake. When that happens, you find a landmark and move toward it. If you can't see it, you become it for someone else. She sat. The first note landed like the heel of a hand on a table when words aren't enough. The hall filled, not just with sound, but with permission. The janitors in the back straightened without meaning to. A boy in a hoodie held his phone up for his grandmother at home. Susan, in a dress that wasn't a uniform, unclenched a muscle she hadn't noticed since winter 20 years ago. Croft listened with his hands folded and his jaw unclamped. Midway through the program, James rose and walked to the side aisle, as if he couldn't sit any longer without doing something the future would recognize. At intermission, he found the club's manager and the program director from the school and the nurse from the hospital ward and said, "Next month, we take this out of the building, gymnasiums, church basements, the park by the river when it's warm. We'll bring a digital piano if we have to. We'll bring chairs if we have to. We'll bring pie if we have to." He smiled, surprised to find he meant the pie most of all. The second half ended with a duet the program didn't list. Croft walked on stage with the careful courage of a man choosing to be seen for the first time. He didn't take the melody. He asked quietly to hold the bass. Clara nodded, and the room understood the apology for what it was. They played a simple arrangement of a folk song 100 kitchens knew by heart. When it finished, there was no eruption, just the long applause a community gives when it forgives and expects better. After the concert, the lobby didn't thin. People lingered in a glow that wasn't champagne. A custodian showed his child where the floor shone because he cared. A teenager asked Clara how to make a left-hand pattern less stiff. She showed him how to breathe through his wrists. Susan took off her shoes and laughed with two waitresses by the coat check, the kind of laugh that rewires a day. James slipped outside into the spring evening. The city smelled like wet pavement and beginnings. He called a number he hadn't dialed in months, the one that connected to the office that handled the foundation that handled his reputation. "Dissolve the naming rights for the new wing," he said. "Reallocate to the school. Anonymous." "Sir?" the assistant said, baffled. "You'll lose visibility." "I'd like to gain vision," he replied, and ended the call. On his way back in, he found Croft alone by the bronze bust of a composer who had never worked a day of manual labor in his life. The pianist looked smaller without a stage. "You were right," Croft said simply. James smiled. "I was young and wrong for longer than you were," he said. "We're all finding our way." He stepped into the hall again. Clara was at the piano, surrounded by kids and kitchen staff and the night watchman with his thermos. She looked up and caught James in the doorway. He made a little conducting gesture, a circle in the air, old habit, and she laughed and played 3 notes in answer, the universal code for stay a while. He did. He stayed to stack chairs and thank ushers and walk Susan and Clara to the bus stop under a street lamp that hummed. He stayed through the last thermos pour and the first janitor's joke. He stayed until the building felt, for the first time in 100 years, like it belonged to the people who kept it standing. When he finally stepped back into the night, the city didn't look richer or cleaner. It looked accountable. A handful of rooms had remembered what they were for, and that is how cities change, by rooms more than by laws. He thought of a metronome that barely ticks, and a word carved badly into its base. Hold. He thought of a girl who played not to be applauded, but to steady everyone within reach. He thought of a building that had chosen, against its habits, to make space. Somewhere in an upstairs office, a vote tally sat in a folder. Somewhere in a downstairs corridor, a sign read, "Piano Room, Open Hours." Somewhere in a small apartment, a mother ironed without humming, because her day no longer needed that kind of saving. The wind lifted and set down. James put his hands in his coat pockets and smiled at the ordinary miracle of people staying after the music ends. The headlines arrived before dawn. Virtuoso program reshapes St. James. Old money, new music. Some praised the initiative. Others sneered that it was charity dressed in chords. Croft avoided interviews. He preferred to work in the mornings now, practicing alone in a side room with the door half open so that passing staff could hear enough to know he was trying. The club's old guard didn't take kindly to humility. They liked winners, not reformers. "You're making us look soft," one board member hissed to Croft over breakfast. "You let a janitor's child walk off with your spotlight." Croft set down his coffee cup. "If light can walk, maybe it wasn't mine to keep." He stood and left the table before the man could answer, but the pushback built. Sponsors whispered about mission drift. Letters arrived from patrons threatening to withdraw funding unless traditional standards were restored. Rumors spread that the mezzanine school would be shut down for maintenance. When the decision leaked, the staff froze. The pianos were locked, schedules erased. Croft found the practice rooms dark again, as if the air had exhaled faith. He went straight to Avery's office, the one the man still used above the warehouse district. "They're killing it," Croft said simply. "You built the foundation, but they're cutting the roots." Avery looked up from his papers. "How long do we have?" 3 days. The closure notice goes public Monday." He exhaled slowly, then smiled. The faint, reckless smile of a man who has decided to stop pretending that diplomacy works better than truth. "Then we give them a concert they can't cancel." The following evening, invitations appeared across the city, printed on cheap paper, delivered by hand, slipped under doors and onto buses. Sunday night, St. James Mezzanine, no tickets, no titles, no locks. By 6 o'clock, the crowd reached the street. Mechanics, nannies, professors, and cab drivers pressed together under the soft rain. Croft sat at the main piano, waiting. Avery stood by the door, his suit rumpled for the first time in decades. Susan handed out cups of tea from a cart. Clara tuned quietly, humming the A above middle C until it matched the human hum of the hallway. When the lights went out, deliberately perhaps, or from a blown fuse, the audience lit the room with their phones. 100 small lights shimmered against the ceiling. Croft looked up and whispered, "Stars." Clara began to play. It wasn't a gala piece or a protest song. It was quiet, steady, a melody that climbed like courage remembering its way home. The crowd followed her rhythm, clapping softly in time. Then another sound joined in, the steady pulse of shoes stamping on the floorboards, a human metronome that made the building itself part of the score. Avery stepped forward, voice carrying through the dark. "You can't shut down a room that belongs to its people." Cameras caught the scene, not from journalists, but from the audience. By morning, the video had circled the world. Hashtags bloomed. Donations poured in. The board's press release evaporated before it was printed. 3 members resigned that day. The others voted to keep the school open indefinitely. The headline on Monday read simply, "Music Wins." Croft met Avery in the courtyard afterward, rain still misting the air. "You realize you just made me unemployable anywhere else," he said. Avery laughed. "Good. You're home." He turned to Clara, who stood with her mother under an umbrella too small for 2. "You led them," he said. Clara shook her head. "No, sir. I just kept time until they found their beat." The last remnant of arrogance in the city's oldest club fell quietly that week, not with scandal, but with applause. The portraits on the wall were moved downstairs to make space for a new one, a photograph of the mezzanine filled with people. No labels, no ranks, only music. Spring settled gently over the city, not with trumpets but with small mercies. The first open window, the first late bus that arrived on time, the first day people stopped calling the St. James the Club and started calling it the Hall. What began as scandal had become custom. What began as charity had turned into rhythm. On Sunday mornings, you could find Susan in the courtyard arranging chairs, while the early light spilled through stained glass and the smell of polish mixed with coffee. The staff came before their shifts to practice. The guests came after theirs to listen. Children leaned against columns tracing notes in the air with their fingers. The janitors learned harmony from the maitre d'. The maitre d' learned patience from the janitors. Clara no longer needed a stage. She played when asked, taught when curious, listened when tired. Her fame had grown past her. Invitations from Vienna, Tokyo, and New York lay unanswered on the kitchen counter. One night, she turned to her mother and said, "If I leave, the sound leaves too." Susan smiled. "Then let it grow here first." And it did. The Peterson Room, named not for prestige, but because Clara refused to have her own name on the door, became the heartbeat of the building. The walls were covered in drawings from children who'd once been too shy to enter. One showed a grand piano growing roots into the ground, its keys turning into branches full of birds. Another simply said, in shaky block letters, "Thank you for letting me touch the music." Julian Croft remained. He stopped performing for applause. Some nights after closing, he played slow etudes for the cleaning crew. Music meant only to fill the air until the vacuuming finished. He said little, but once, when Clara passed by, he murmured, "I used to chase perfection. Now I just try not to disturb it." James Avery came less often, preferring to watch from a distance. He'd handed the keys of the hall to a foundation run by its own workers, drawing only one condition in the contract. The moment you start charging people to belong, you've lost the reason to stay open. His lawyer had called it legally fragile. He'd called it faith. One evening, months later, he returned unannounced. The building was alive. Laughter from the mezzanine, a scale from the basement, a kettle whistling somewhere behind the reception desk. Clara spotted him near the door and waved. "You came back," she said. "Just checking on an investment," he replied. "I wanted to see if it's still paying interest." "What kind of interest?" she asked. "The kind you can't measure." He followed her upstairs to the old ballroom, now converted into a community studio. A dozen students sat at mismatched keyboards, heads bowed in the quiet focus of learning. A boy hesitated over a chord, his fingers trembling. Clara knelt beside him. "Breathe," she whispered. "Find the center." The boy did, pressing the keys again, slower this time, and the sound came, thin but true. Avery watched as she nodded approval. He turned to the window. Outside, dusk had turned the city gold. He thought of his father's words, "Build something that doesn't end with you," and realized this might finally be it. When he left, he stopped by the lobby piano, the one that had started everything. Its surface bore scratches now from use, initials carved by children's coins, and a faint handprint in the dust near middle C. He pressed a single key, low, resonant, enough to feel rather than hear, and smiled. In the months that followed, stories spread of a janitor's son composing his first symphony, of a teacher who used music therapy for veterans, of a night when rain flooded the streets, but people stayed anyway, singing in the candlelight while Clara played barefoot to keep the power of sound alive. No one called her a prodigy anymore. She'd become something rarer, a constant. Years later, when reporters asked what she remembered most from the night she'd first been laughed at, Clara answered simply, "I remember the sound before the music, the silence of people deciding what I was worth. I learned to fill it with something better." And so she did. Every day thereafter, the St. James Hall stood open year-round. There were no velvet ropes, no ranks, no reservations, only music available.